Interesting, crucial areas where politics, education and research intersect. Actually, Michael's first approach was to say, can you do something about your research into the academies? And I thought that was maybe shortchanging you a little bit. So I do want to enter into that at one stage, but summarize it, but also point you towards my website where you'll be able to read more of the data. I think you all realize, or at least many of you realize, that it's quite dangerous to just look upon research as the data, especially just as numerical data. Because there are all sorts of assumptions, discourses, narratives that underpin that and surround it and connect it up with the whole policy configuration. I must apologise for the title because my own grandchildren are not growing up in Goveland. We live in Scotland. His jurisdiction does not go further. And when I did try to Google Michael Gove images, I found so many that you could fill a National Portrait Gallery. It's wonderful. It's quite entertaining if it wasn't so nightmarish. But I want to have a look at some of the rhetoric, some of the narratives. You could do an entire media course, couldn't you, on interpreting these gestures? But even more so, interpreting some of the key quotations. If children are educated in an environment where hard work is expected, where every child is assumed capable of success and no excuses are allowed for failure, then children will succeed from any background. I find that really quite unnerving. The best word I know is chutzpah, but to translate it into vernacular English, I suppose a bloody cheek. From somebody involved in a government that's done so much damage and is doing so much damage to the lives of children and others and adults in low-income families, to then talk in these terms, I think is really highly significant. But there is a poem that comes to mind, and maybe I should try it, see if I can remember it. It's only 4 lines long. Roger McGough once wrote, in rather different circumstances, there are fascists pretending to be humanitarians, like cannibals on a health kick, eating only vegetarians. I think it's neat, is that? I wonder if maybe we might have some comments. What particular narratives do you think are running through this? What particular discourses? Anybody like to throw something in? Any particular words that jump out?
Well, discipline.
Okay, yes.
Discipline of the self and discipline of others.
Yeah. Okay.
Failure is due to not working hard enough.
Okay, yeah.
It's about teachers as well, because there are no excuses. I presume are no excuses from teachers.
Okay, yes. I suppose both, yeah. Yeah.
Implies that teachers have low expectations, and if they just address those, everything would be fine.
Yes. Yeah.
All you need is hard work.
Yeah.
There's no understanding of the different backgrounds and experiences that those children are going to have. It almost dismisses that as they can overcome it by working hard.
I find it quite really quite bizarre. I think there are things running through on a wider social level. There seems to be. Okay, let's go back to the quotation. There seems to be a notion of an obstacle-free meritocracy, a structure-free individual agent who will just rise due to hard work, which I find quite bizarre in a society which is so heavily structured, so strongly hierarchical, to believe that agency is all and that structure is nothing. And that hits against all of the rhetoric we've had about benefit scroungers and all the rest of it, and provides a sort of contrast. Obviously, there's the proper education, the traditional values thing. But I also, there's a narrative of school improvement here. All schools can do it. Blame the teachers, as you say. This inflated view of the powers of agency, this incredible voluntarism, is carried along by this odd notion of leadership that is so dominant at the moment. Very strange link with actions which actually make qualification harder, not easier. There's a whole PISA envy thing running around some of this, not so much in that particular quotation. Yes, the Freudians among us have spotted the joke. There is still a lot of neoliberal knowledge economy stuff, that the global race, education boosts the economy, the more highly qualified we are, all the jobs will magically appear, it's all school's fault, and so on. I think it's some very, very complex mixture of ideologies here. Some of them Victorian, some of them modern neoliberal. And incredible silences, a whole silence about privatisation. It's not a word that Michael Gove would use, though I'd argue that very often his neoconservatism actually is directed to that end. The more schools you can fail, the more you can privatise. And that's where I think the link with Academies. And no mention of austerity in his discourse, which is very strange. Is this being summoned, these discourses of self-help, being summoned to assist the create divisions, shift the blame work that other government departments are doing? I think it's very, very telling to really spend a bit of time on these discourses. The rhetoric of leadership, yes, which I find really quite strange and seriously inflated. And I think it's all part of this extreme voluntarism that we've got. You've all seen the film. And there's a little narrative about leadership that I've emphasised with the captions here. Sam says, I think we're hitting a few problems, boss. Oh, what's the matter now, Sam? I've passed my management course. I've got an A-star in leadership skills and building capacity in our organisation. Might not be sure where we're heading, but you can't have everything. How can we use the word leadership without having any sense of direction? It is most bizarre. It does fit in with a sort of end of history scenario when all you've got left is make the machinery more efficient, make it function better. But I think we really do have to ask questions around words like leadership and improvement, of direction, of values, and take much more seriously these words that are usually trivialized about vision and mission and values, which are treated as if it was simply a matter of rearranging the chairs on the Titanic in order to, and that counts as your school's vision. We'll have houses this year. We had year groups last. We'll have an extra deputy head. And we remember that enclosures were described as improvement, which they were for the big house on the hill. I don't doubt for a minute, and I've seen many wonderful examples, that some schools can be more successful than others. I'm deliberately avoiding the word effective for all the baggage that carries. And particularly that some schools are absolutely terrific in educating some of the harder to reach kids. But I think there's a seriously inflated version of this. A year ago, Nick Gibb, who was schools minister then, found from the statistics that there were 21 schools in England where 80% of children 80% of free school meal children were getting their 5 A to C with English and maths. That's quite remarkable. When I actually looked at this, I found that a quarter of them were grammar schools. They only allowed in free school meal children if they're already brilliant at the age of 10 or 11. Another 10 were in small rural towns with only a handful of free school meal children anyway. And we were left with 6, of which 3 were selective religious schools. Now, it'd be very, very interesting to look at the other 3. But on this basis, to claim that it's up to you, if one school can do it, the rest of you can do it, I think is really quite hypocritical. And we've got to remember that, as John Bangs and John Macbeth said, and many, many others have used these statistics, even the most ardent school effectiveness advocates are still stuck with less than 15% that they can pin on the school effect. They can pin something more on differences between teachers, but the vast majority is really quite random. You know, some of it, how do you measure personality difference between 2 siblings apparently identically educated? I speak as a father of 2 girls who are now grown up and wonderful parents in very different ways. I've become fascinated about school effectiveness and school improvement, and I think leadership as paradigms in a research sense, but also in terms of a paradigm of practice, and decided to delve into this for my own PhD, which drew on other publications. And I think it taps into a long-standing interest that goes back to Raymond Williams and Terry Eagleton in the late 60s when I was at university, and their transformation of English literature teaching, R.D. Lang with his anti-psychiatry, and all sorts of others. Kuhn's very, very famous look at how an anomaly can lead to a new model, a new way of thinking. All sorts of other examples here, like what difference does it make if you change the scale? It leads to a different sort of emphasis in biology. You know, we shift from Mendel and his green and yellow peas to Darwin with his big time span. And that paradigms actually go all the way down. They're not just a different way of understanding the world. There's a different ontology there. There is a different sense of what the basic units are. And I think it's true to say that the basic unit of school effectiveness and the model of school improvement that's been modelled on that and is so closely linked with that is the school as a separate managed entity. That is the crucial thing. It relates to everything that's going on in terms of a transformation of the management of schools. It relates to the setting up of schools in competition with each other. In competition in a sort of quasi-market, you know, with a big emphasis placed on school choice, parental choice, artificially driven by league tables of comparative test and exam results. This is not neutral territory. These words and these models, these ways of looking at things are highly ideological. Paradigms is about entities, what the basic entities and forces that you see as being at work, what models, what are the legitimate problems and solutions, but as well as the methods. And also they're in the social realm, in social sciences, they're about the political dimension. Does it privilege some perspectives over others? They're about the ethical dimension of the practitioner and researcher's responsibility for a moral evaluation of practice and not simply what works. The paradigm issue, I think, is really quite important. School effectiveness and school improvement, actually, they're the result of a rather strange marriage round about 1991, which we take for granted, but you can trace it back to a particular collaboration. If anybody wants to read more deeply into this, you know, I'll point them the way of things that I've written and others have written. School effectiveness, strongly statistical, its origins in comparative teaching effectiveness studies with a certain circularity because the tests they use to check that one type of teaching is better than another are very limited tests. A lot of the school effectiveness work in the realm of teaching is based on certain versions of primary numeracy, actually. School improvement is really derived from big implementation projects of curriculum innovation. And to suddenly throw those two together in a way that was seemingly unaware of context, of sort of high Thatcherism, of a neoliberal reconstitution of schools, is less than innocent. But it was drifted into, maybe. It was rapidly accepted. It became the flavour of the day. And it's not the first time in the history of educational research that a particular way of looking at things becomes dominant because it's what people what powers that be seem to need at that time. To make judgments about schools on the basis of numbers alone, I think is highly reductionist, and I'm not decrying statistical methods, but I'm using the word in the same way that Hilary and Stephen Rose use it. All the natural sciences use mathematics, but when you reduce things down to a simple laboratory model, you've got to fit the bits together again when you rebuild it, and you want a much richer view of the world. The maths will provide some of the sometimes some of the problems and not some of the answers. And I think the same thing is at work here. And there are all sorts of fallacies. To rely so heavily on free meals, which is only a very partial indicator of disadvantage. And to imagine that two schools are similar because they've both got a quarter of their pupils on free meals, when you might have one of them with what's been called a bipolar distribution, where a quarter of the pupils are children of graduate professional parents. Now that's happening less and less because of the market system, but it does invalidate very seriously some of these simplistic methods of comparison. Looking at school improvement, I suppose the foundational statement is from Michael Fullan, you know, it was very much the poster boy of school improvement. It's actually borrowed from somebody else. You can't mandate what matters. A belief that you need serious discussion to lead to serious change if people are going to be engaged with it. You need serious collegial discussion, but constantly undermined, partly because there isn't that serious discussion about the aims of education. The collegial process is overturned when upscaling. Michael Barber, who was the school improvement expert under the last government, now is working for a private corporation. I think he's now working for Pearson. He let slip one day that when he introduced the literacy hour and the numeracy hour, he quoted from Pascal, a 16th century theologian from 17th century? 17th century theologian from France. And Pascal said, if you're concerned if you want to teach the peasants how to pray, first of all, get them on their knees. Now that, as the hidden approach, get everybody doing the literacy hour and then one day they'll understand it, I think is totally inadequate. So I'm really raising some questions here that I've written about at some length in various ways and for different audiences, about the way in which this core notion, which is quite democratic and collegial, is constantly undermined by the macro environment that it's deployed in. And people use the word culture in all sorts of strange ways, so that again, that gets reduced. The culture of the school just gets reduced to attendance at staff meetings, agreeing to become a member of a committee. Capacity for change is almost become synonymous with culture, whereas we really ought to be asking questions like, is there a culture of alienated learning? Do what you're told, finish on time, and you get a mark, and then go on to the next lesson. A culture of target setting. Is there a culture in the staff room of derogatory remarks about children, maybe? Are there assumptions about ability being fixed in some way? So if we're really serious about the word culture, we need to delve into these areas. And very seriously, I think the majority of the school improvement experts in England actually ought to spend a little time looking at other shelves in the library, looking seriously at pedagogy, looking at sociological writings and so on, because the field tends to be vague, apolitical, and managerialist. And above all else, it's proved to be impotent with regard to poverty-linked underachievement. There was a long time when they didn't write anything about this. And then there was a collaboration of some of the real stars in the field, funded by the Department for Education. And they were asked to work solidly with a dozen schools over the course of 3 years. And when you actually looked at the statistics, what had happened was that the schools, half the schools didn't change, and the other half, as a result of official versions of school improvement, had changed to easier qualifications. Now, I think that, I'm going to come onto Academies in a minute. Around the year 2000, I managed to put some time aside to visit for a few days each 10 schools with large numbers of bilingual pupils from Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds that were very successful and thriving institutions. And I found that rather than the bank clamp down the hatches and back to basics approach, these were places of rich learning. These were places where children really felt they counted. These were places of a genuine empowerment. I've still got a lot of the pictures, a connectedness with local culture of different groups, the sense of future, a sense of hope, a sense of identity. Interesting story here. I was having a talk with the deputy head when Raheem walked in, who was 15, and said, "Adam, is it all right if you use the phone?" Picked up the phone and left us to our conversation. What's going on here? He was organising a conference on child labour in India and in Britain. You know, they were connecting with the local area. This was part of their literacy. Their literacy involved exploring their situation, their context. I just don't have time to show you the many different ways in which, but read that first book. There's still copies around. The Power to Learn, 10 case studies. I think some very powerful stories through all of that. I don't have time to explain these pictures, but basically, teachers who gain the courage and confidence to explore new ways of managing. Hell, did I actually write that? Managing learning. Oh, I could draw a line through that one, I think. Curricula which connect up with the real lives of the learners. Relationships that enable the learners to find a voice, and a counterculture to the despair of a community. And I've got a new book out in about 2 months' time, which is taking a systematic look at some of the explanations that have been provided over the last half century for why some kids fail, why many kids don't do well at school. Called it Living on the Edge. It's a collaboration with an Australian colleague called John Smythe. And we've actually come to the conclusion that rather than focus on schools as a manageable entity in competition with other schools, we've got to look at how schools relate to the social psychology, we could call it, of chronic levels of high levels of unemployment, of poor work, of casual, underpaid, unreliable work. And in areas of heavy deindustrialisation, I think the two key words are shame, a sense of shame. Might be my fault, maybe, you know, this interiorisation, but also futility, that however hard you try, nothing might come of it. The successful schools are the ones that do something different, that provide a counterculture to this in all sorts of different ways. And we're drawing on Bourdieu, but also, very interestingly, on Goveland, symbolic interactionist, very strongly interested in issues of what he calls total institutions, a book called Asylums. Can I just do a sounding? Has anybody in this room read Goveland's Asylums? Yeah, interesting, yes. It's I think this has got so much to tell us about the situation of kids who go in and out of two worlds every day. I think there are even bigger problems there than joining a monastery or going to a boarding school or something like that. You know, certainly the more benign forms of total institutions. I'm sure mental hospitals and prisons are rather different. But it was the inability of official school improvement that led, I think, to the last government searching for its magic answer. And you can see it all here. City Academy, Bristol. I think the one on the right is Mossburn. I don't know where the one on the bottom is. And I've been looking at this. It's quite interesting that academies were introduced under a flag of social justice. And I've had various goes at this and been published several times. But last year I got some money to work with a colleague at Manchester, Aphrodite Kalambuka, on updating some of this work. We found this was very similar to the data on smaller groups of academies in previous years. We didn't deal with the new batch of conversions. These were all schools that had become academies under the previous government. And there were two fundamental reasons why, with a few exceptions, why they appeared to be doing very well. And I think there's a big question here about why the officially commissioned research systematically ignored both of these issues, has not asked questions about changing pupil population, and has not asked questions about, you know, the switch over, the reliance to a very heavy extent on the GNVQ certificates, BTECs now, that counted as 4 subjects. The work is on my website, changingschools.org.uk. It's very easy to find. If you Google it, you seem to get all sorts of things about how to change schools if you're not satisfied about what school your kid's going to, which is a bit unfortunate. But if I could just go into the main findings, that actually basically academies are not improving faster than similar schools, because schools with lower levels of qualifications are actually improving faster than the average, whether academies or not. Disadvantaged pupils, and this has been confirmed by various sources, disadvantaged pupils do no better in academies, and without reliance on the GNVQ equivalent, they're actually doing worse. That 1 in 7 of the schools fell below the floor target. But if you adjusted that floor target to take account of the Academy's heavy use of equivalents, it would be 1 in 3, and almost as many among the academies that have already been open for 5 years. Instead, if we go back to this one, I mentioned Walsall, because one of the first, this was one of the biggest, this was one of the most glaring. In a year, that school had changed from having 51% of pupils on free meals to having 11% of pupils on free meals. Now there's some mighty deselection process going on here, and I don't just mean the year 7 pupils either. There's a rather exaggerated claim that all of these academies, and we're talking about pre-coalition, were replacing failing schools in very poor areas. It was a much more mixed picture than that. And there was also very little consistency from in terms of what was happening in the sponsor chains. Does anybody want to come back at me? Okay.
Just wondered if you could comment on, you talked about a mix of all kinds of things in school policies and so on. I just wonder if you could comment on the role of families in this and the emphasis of families and their part in, let's say, school improvement.
Yes. Well, I think for a start, in our present school system, families are kept on the margins. We still have got that situation where you queue up for your child in primary school, or your grandchild, in my case, somewhere on the other side of the bicycle shed. You know, and that's the first thing, lost opportunity. There's been a major European piece of research called Included, led by a team based in Barcelona. And this is one of their two major findings, that the schools successful against the odds were the ones that fully involved parents as volunteers and in all sorts of other ways. Their other finding, incidentally, was the abolition of any form of streaming in its many different forms. Now, I have issues with them because they've underemphasized, I think, questions of curriculum formation and questions of pedagogy. But I think the family issue is very seriously there. I think over the years, families have figured very strongly, and still do, in terms of the discussion of underachievement. In a deficit way, they're always, since the days when notions of fixed intelligence, innate intelligence, collapsed, when it was discovered that Cyril Burt's twin studies were fraudulent. And then Bernstein came along with his notion of a restricted code. Again, a flawed piece of research, and heavily, wish we got more time to talk about it. But families have appeared in a deficit way as people to blame. It's happening now around the notion of aspirations, as if this was the source of the problem. The kids don't have aspirations, the parents don't have aspirations. A wonderful paper I came across by Jessica Bock in Queensland talks about roadmap. He says it's not as if these kids have no aspirations, it's that they're responding to a lack of opportunities, and their parents actually don't know the way forward. Whereas there's some studies about aspirations in some of the big independent schools, some of the big elite schools in Britain, show that these kids are steered every inch of the way. They don't even need aspirations in an individual sense, because they're shaped by it's aspirations. It's a sort of collective thing. Let's bring somebody in to talk about what it's like to do medicine at Oxford. We've got a former pupil we can call on. Yeah? I'm not caricaturing here. It's quite a different matter. So to cast everything onto the... I think the up-to-date research on language retardation, as the Americans would call it, in areas of poverty, again, gives a very misleading impression. And if you look deeper into the statistics, you will find that among the poorest section of the population, it is a minority of families where you can say there is any degree of neglect, lack of stimulation, lack of linguistic development. What you do find, though, is some other families have a sort of concerted cultivation of the child's experiences, the vocabulary, and so on. Researchers have even plugged into parents talking about their 4-year-old's CV. Oh yes, I've got to get him into a dance class because we'll get it onto his CV. What an incredible world of child abuse this is, at whatever level we're talking about. So I think we've got to reframe the way we're thinking about families. Yeah? That's another image, a different one from the array. I find another interesting bit of this narrative, these discourses, is the the PISA envy, the appeal to the high-achieving countries in the world. Various ones: Finland, Singapore, Massachusetts, Alberta. Well, I think that's about it. And then places in East Asia where kids are very heavily crammed. He appeals to this everywhere. And this is part of a Blairite version of neoliberalism, of global competition. The only control we've got over the future of the economy is to become the best qualified country in the world, etc. And when I saw the name Finland attached to the beginning of Michael Gove's speech about making GCSEs harder last week, I immediately emailed a former student of mine who was on our BEd course in Edinburgh 7 years ago, and said, Saku, do you have really hard exams for 16-year-olds in Finland? And he said, we don't have any. Our first public exams at age 19, and actually, pre-university matriculation. And actually, it's coming in for a lot of criticism because it's reducing and limiting learning. The kids have been learning in better ways without it, which I find really quite interesting. Because there you have a system where teachers do not give children any grades or numerical marks till age 12, where they abolished inspectors in about 1990, and so on, and where anything other than mixed ability classes is disallowed, as it is across Scandinavia. But teachers with a serious interest in learning, teachers who have got master's degrees, all of them, as a standard, certainly anybody with a permanent teaching job in Finland, and some of them gain it, gradually at work, and are free with only 4% child poverty, and free healthy lunch for all pupils. Now, a rather different emphasis. I had a look at, I've become a bit notorious for having written those words, too much, too young. Yes, it's me to blame, the bad grammar award. They didn't even, the 100 academics letter condemning Gove's curriculum. I'm sure if I'd have contacted Wolverhampton, we could have had 200 very, very quickly. Yes. Somebody in The Guardian, actually, we never got an award, we never got any money, we weren't invited to a ceremony, so I'm a bit mystified, but somebody did say maybe Mr. Gove's friends would have liked them to say too much too youngly, so that it could be a proper adverb. If we actually have a look at the details of the proposed curriculum, the children have disappeared. It's the Pied Piper curriculum. I don't know how anybody can claim to be laying foundations for excellence later on if they don't engage with young children around that exploration of experience, perceptions, and symbolic knowledge. I'll give you an example. At the same age, the age of 7, when the Finnish kids are expected to sort of divide cakes into quarters and thirds and learn how you write this in numbers as a fraction, the English kids will be expected to do the calculation of 6/7 minus 2/7 equals. There is something missing here. So there's a question about foundations. Actually, the first version of this, which was sent out more selectively, it was sent to the union headquarters last July, and they haven't made any changes since, except they deleted this first example. It included among the spelling list chauffeur and champagne at the age of 7, but that was a bit too much of a giveaway. I spotted it. I used it in the headline and it disappeared. So that's my minor impact on educational policy in England. But still, affect and effect. I've thought about my own granddaughter, and they're not part of her vocabulary, either of those words, either in the books that she reads or in spoken language. We have a rule-bound world where somehow ta, ha, eh can be sounded out and produce the. You know, pardon? Where 7 or 8 year olds can learn how to spell by learning a rule. You add ali, not le, after ik, except for publicly. I don't think we'd ever write anything if we'd been taught like this. Apart from if you haven't read Simon Sharma's speech at the Hay Literary Festival about the history proposal, you know, it's a must read. And he was chosen by Michael Gove to be the history guru. The newspapers called it History Czar, which he didn't like very much. It's too much about pogroms against Jews by czars, so there was something a bit ironic there. But there is no thought to relevance or connectedness or learner agency, a little sense of children solving problems, exploring ideas, and certainly no sense of ethics, citizenship, environment. And really, very, very strangely, there isn't any more an induction into academic disciplines, which I think was present in the first national curriculum. If you think about history, Key Stage 1, it was about talking to Granny about what life was like when she was young and looking at old teddy bears and seaside postcards and so on and so forth. It was very, very different. Something rather strange is going on here, which seems to, and it's somehow around that conjunction of, and I still haven't got my understood it fully, but it's where neoliberal meets neoconservative and can't quite work out an answer. And I do wonder whether the failure, that making everything harder, setting impossible demands for 7-year-olds, setting a test to read nonsense words where 40% fail, whether this is actually intentional and where this claim of higher standards is actually driven by the neoliberal desire to privatize more and more schools. Michael Rosen, the children's poet, has suggested that actually failing pupils is quite significant because these kids could grow up blaming themselves for their chronic unemployment. And you don't want, the big spark across the Mediterranean has been when large numbers of unemployed graduates. Dangerous, politically very, very dangerous. So I think that's it. And very, very strangely, that is never ever mentioned. You know, there's a widespread consensus that we need to restore confidence. I didn't know there was a lack of confidence until the last year or two, and so on and so forth. And somehow in that last paragraph, the idea that, the higher qualifications will generate jobs, rather than the reverse. I don't know what generates jobs, but I'm not convinced it's simply more children getting GCSEs. I think we've got somehow to move beyond this very limited, high stakes, blame the parents, blame the teachers, blame the children way of looking at the whole issue. The data is actually very, very solid, and it's been highlighted in one PISA report after another. Actually, the difference between high and low average attaining countries is the size of the tail. And incidentally, somebody's now published a book about the tail, which says that privatisation is the answer to that as well. They happen to be a director of the Academies group, which didn't surprise me. And they've come up with some phony research that teach first improves everybody in the school, unlike ordinary teachers who don't have a clue. There's some crazy stuff going on that we need to pay some more attention to. This latest book I've mentioned, I think it is desperately important to deal with these issues at a theoretical level. the reference to Goveland and to Bourdieu is that we need to focus much more on that question of interaction, how children relate to school, how teachers relate to children, their families, their different lives. I don't know if I've just 1 minute. I'll just tell one little story that I think highlights this. A school in Edinburgh that I've become involved with we stopped it from closure recently. I think it's probably the only case of a secondary school, except in the Hebrides, with less than 200 children that we've stopped from closing. Very, very poor area of the city. But some years ago, a wonderful bunch of teachers, and I sat through a day's lessons, and it just seemed to me that everything was actually about a deficit view of the children's lives. Because we drift into these things. We meet a crisis-ridden family and suddenly everybody's like that. So in the course of a day, we had alcohol abuse, we had early pregnancy, we had bad food, lack of exercise, all the rest of it. And never in all that time were the children allowed to speak about their lives. It was always somebody else's view of what their lives must be like. Until finally, a 35-year-old male science teacher with nice little plastic models of the embryo growing in the womb at different stages came unstuck when somebody mentioned waters breaking, and at last the female 45-year-old local classroom assistant was allowed to speak. She'd been sort of stuck there in the corner till then. And then the kids joined in, and they knew, these were 13-year-olds, the girls knew a lot about pregnancy and childbirth. It was obvious, the families, extended families and so on, and had a nice little chat with the teacher afterwards, and said, these girls actually really do know a lot. And it was the first time they'd spoken all day. I said, where do you think that knowledge might come from? He said, well, it wasn't me. It must have been their primary school teachers. I'll stop there because I think, I think it's a point for development. Okay. I hope I haven't let you down by not talking for an hour about academies. Any comments, questions? Yeah?
I think some of those values do appeal to a lot of people in the public generally, because I think people do believe that if you do work hard, you can achieve something. I think one of the difficulties in terms of where we are at the moment is the disjuncture between education and the kind of society outside. I mean, 50 years ago when Education of the Working Class was written by Jackson and Marsden, a working class kid could probably go out into the world and at least get some sort of a working class job that they could achieve at a reasonable level. In the last 30 years, that social structure has been destroyed. So in a way, the disjuncture between education, class and society is much greater than it was, say 50 years ago and something like that.
There's a limit to how much we can solve educational problems separately.
There's a limit to the extent to which education can solve the problems of society. That's always been the case. But I say those sort of values that are encapsulated in that quote from Joe do appeal to large numbers of the population in the way there is a kind of element of truth in some of it about hard work and achievement. And also...
And there are people who've given up for various reasons.
They're very attractive ideas, though, aren't they? They're very attractive ideas to a lot of people because they give people a comforting illusion of control over what's happening to them. And quite often it's control that they simply don't have. But they like to think that they can take control. And that's one of the worrying things about it. As you rightly point out, they're telling people what they'd like to hear, almost as a comforter in a way. And that's why the fact that there's a small element of truth in there, or sort of what seems to be common sense, is what makes them appealing to such a large number of people.
And a certain amount of self-congratulation. I've done it through my own hard work.
It's a myth of meritocracy.
I mean, Gove's got a very interesting biography. It was adopted at a very early age, and then went to a school that currently charges fees of 11,000 a year. I mean, I think he won some sort of a bursary, but his parents paid something, and we can't all get adopted. You know? Well, maybe. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to say how much I enjoyed your talk. I absolutely agree with everything that you've said, and I think what depresses me is I hear so little in the public domain of the kind of well-argued criticisms and, dare I say, evidence-based, critique of this kind of neoliberal discourse we get from Gove. And I just find it very depressing. You watch Newsnight, you watch Question Time, we all read The Guardian and all the rest of it. And the lack of really thought through critique that's hitting the mainstream so that there's some kind of public debate is pitiful. And I think the media, really haven't engaged with a lot of these very well-known academic research and the critiques you were making. These have been out there in academia for a long time, and it's just very depressing that there seems to be very little penetration into the mainstream discourse, so that it's a terribly one-sided argument all the time for people who aren't in academia and who aren't interested in it. And I just wondered what your thoughts on that were. Why do you think they've colonised this debate to such an extent?
I don't know, but it is very, very frustrating. I mean, a number of times that myself and others tried to get material on the Academies success story into the Guardian and were turned down. And one education correspondent said to me, well, we all knew that comprehensive schools were rubbish in London. It is very difficult to sort of penetrate.
Yeah, I'm trying to avoid having a conspiracy theory mindset on this, but it is very depressing. It's been going on for a long time, hasn't it? So
I think certain opinions sort of circulated in the parties in a certain environment.
And they don't send their children to comprehensive schools, I'm guessing.
I mean, Melissa Ben's argument about why the free schools is because actually London is such a mixed city with people living close to each other that they've got to eke out separate schools for their children if they can't afford fees. Yeah. It's a comprehensive school provided every child is going to be good at Latin.
Yeah. Falling man.
Yes. Very, very frustrating. I mean, on the other hand, I think we can make some professional spaces. I spoke at a conference on Saturday in London around the primary charter, which I must circulate it, and it's already received. It was floated just from one union branch. It's received approval from the NUT conference, ATL at national level, and the National Association of Primary Education. It's a very simple 300 or 400 word statement, well presented, about the core beliefs to protect, the learning of young children. So I think we can create some more spaces, I think, and the role of teacher educators is particularly significant here as keeping a space open of dialogue with teachers and with parents. Okay. Enjoy your evening. You've been very patient. Thank you.